What happens when your life, your job, your friends, your faith all revolves around one church, and then that church hurts you? Well, today on the show, we're specifically talking about megachurches and the spiritual abuse that is allowed to fester in many of these church systems. We're going to look at their influence and their rise and their definition, and of course, take a peek at the damage that's sitting right behind all of their so called successes. And I do need to warn us today there's some minor but not explicit talk about sexual abuse. And our guest today is Scott Latta. Scott is the author of Gods of the Smoke Machine, Power, Pain, and the Rise of Christian Nationalism in the Megachurch. Through powerful storytelling and extensive reporting, because Scott is a journalist, Scott explores how unchecked charisma, cultural convenience, and the absence of accountability has shaped some of the most influential churches in America, and what happens when the pursuit of power becomes the mission. I'm Jake Doberenz, and this is Christianity Without Compromise, a podcast for Christians who love Jesus but are tired of culture war faith. Now, let's get to rebuilding a faith that actually looks like Jesus. Okay, Scott, it is really good to have you on the show today. I appreciated reading your book, although it was kind of like watching a horror movie or something where you're like, don't go into the room, but instead it was a church of don't have that really lax accountability and allow that abuser to abuse again. But still, really important work there in Gods of the Smoke Machine.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. I am excited to dig into some of this stuff. There's a lot in your book, and we cannot cover every story. And I would, first of all, I'd be really surprised if you remembered every little story and thread that you touched on. Well, we'll hit some of the highlights there and some of the themes and things of that nature. But I want you to start off by talking about some of your megachurch experience before doing all the research in the book. If you can take us back to one of the last churches that you walked out of in your 20s, you were at this megachurch in Nashville. Just kind of tell us that story and why you said, not for me.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. It's a good question. So I think megachurches have always been kind of on my mind. I grew up in a large church, a large Southern Baptist church in Birmingham in the South. My wife and I moved around in the South and landed in Nashville for a while. And we were in our 20s and just kind of trying to figure out where we fit in our faith. We were kind of working through those big questions that you do, right? When you leave home and you're just kind of trying to find your place. But I had family members in large churches. I had friends that went to large churches. I had, been very involved in large churches. And so it was kind of, honestly, it was like our last gasp of trying to find a church that fit for us. We did this like mega church circuit in Nashville, it's got a ton of big churches. You could take your pick. Mm-hmm. And I remember very clearly the moment where it was the last time I think I walked out of a church before I reported this book. Was my wife and I were in this big mega church. I don't remember the name, but the worship pastor got up and he was kind of the very cliche sort of Nashville hipster mega church pastor with like the man bun and the tight jeans and all that. And I think he even had a British accent, and he got up with his guitar and he was like, all right, everyone, sing together with me. And he launched into this like ridiculous falsetto voice. And my wife and I just looked at each other. And like, that was the last time I walked out of a church, because it made me think about just how much everything I was seeing was for show. And I think that is really, I couldn't do any more of that. And I mean, we'll get into it, and not to paint with too broad a brush, but that was my personal faith experience. Was like, I was also working a full-time job in an evangelical company at the time. So like I needed to just kind of take a step away. And that, that British guy in the falsetto voice was the last straw.
Well, for sure, there's some show and performance going on in churches of that nature. And we're also going to peek behind the curtain today to see some of the other ugly stuff that isn't necessarily on the stage. But I think it's really important, though. We're talking megachurches today. and that word gets tossed around a lot. But in God to the Smoke Machine, you offer this specific kind of working definition. Um, can you kind of just walk us through what you're calling a mega church, kind of the shared patterns in these churches? Describe that for us so we're all on the same page here today.
Yeah, totally. So there's kind of a working statistical definition of a megachurch that you see used in reporting, and it's any church that has at least 2,000 people. Now, I think that number is pretty arbitrary. A church with 1,900 people is no different than a church of 2,100. And a lot of the churches I get into in the book are like the ultra mega churches of like 10,000, 20,000, 60,000 people. And those are just a completely different beast. But that is kind of the baseline. You need a number. So the number that you see is 2,000 people. I tend to take a different sort of definition of a megachurch, a more probably sociological definition of a church, which is it's any church that's big enough to have the resources to reach into all the different areas of your life, right? So it's not just your church on Sunday, but it's also your small group on Thursday, but it's also the podcast you listen to. It's the hoodie that you wear, the mug you drink out of. It might be where your kids go to school. It could be where you work. It could be your marriage counselor. It's all of these things, right? And as megachurches have really grown their footprint and as churches have consolidated, especially coming out of the pandemic, megachurches are growing their share of people who go to church. So as we've probably all seen numbers where evangelicalism in the US is on the decline or it's flattened out, but it's on the decline certainly since the turn of the century. But the average megachurch is growing. From 2015 to 2020, the median megachurch grew 10%. So as a writer, I was interested in that. My first question was why? And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but a lot of it comes back to these resources that all the things these churches have to offer you. And I think that is what differentiates churches on this scale.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. It's hard to define it, and there's different kind of definitions there. Um, but you gave us a good direction to think about. And just to bring one of the quotes from your book that I wrote down that I liked, you said that all mega churches subscribe to a basic pattern. They are marvelously convenient, supremely comfortable, culturally familiar, and led by either a founding couple of a singular magnetic personality who is almost by either a founding couple or a singular magnetic personality who is almost without exception a man. Um, and I liked that one. I thought that got to the heart to it. It's this big thing that is everywhere and omnipresent almost. Um, and yeah, they're comfortable, they're convenient, all that they're familiar, all that thing. I think that is a good way to wrap our head around all of this. And I happen to be located. Yes, go for it.
No, I was just going to echo what you were just saying, that I think that that's one of the real differentiators is that megachurches have built a model where culturally they look like, the world around you, which I actually think, so the point of the book is about how people get hurt in these churches. And I actually think that's one of the things that leads to people getting hurt is these churches open the doors really wide to welcome in anyone. And then you get in and you get drawn more deeply into the church and you start to hit issues of like legalism, fundamentalism, evangelicalism. And you see that, it's some people feel misled once they get brought in because they were told, this church looks like everything else. The music sounds like everything else. The clothes, like you don't have to change anything about yourself to go there on a Sunday morning, and people might not even talk to you. But then as you get drawn more deeply into them, that's where, you realize it's actually something different. That's what I heard from people in my reporting.
Yeah. And I do want to draw people's attention to something you said, specifically in the book, that like, you have some of these problems in churches of all sizes, but you are literally like magnifying everything. When you get to the scale, the problems are going to be more present. I think that's important to remember as well. It's not just mega churches that have problems,
Totally.
but it does seem to be a particular case where yeah, some of that is magnified because you're dealing with just these incredibly large institutions. And as I was going to say earlier, like I live right next to the biggest church in the world, right? I'm in the same city as Life Church, and it's It's interesting too, also that church um, didn't end up being as bad. Like you didn't actually seem to have as much bad things to say about that one. That's probably not the way to phrase it journalistically, but that one went out not as scathed, I guess. But yeah, massive organization, and a lot of times harm is just becomes a part of those systems.
Yeah. I can kind of speak to something you just said there, which is that when I first started reporting the book, one of my kind of working questions that I would ask pastors and others in interviews was, is there something about really large churches that makes them more prone to incidents of harm or abuse and things like that? And most people said no, to your point about you can get hurt in a church of any size, which is certainly true. And I've certainly seen that in my own experience. And we all know that that's the case. So I kind of stopped asking that and started working under a different sort of inquiry, I would say, as I got more into the reporting, which is not, is there something about a megachurch that makes it more prone to abuse? But what is it about megachurches that leads to cases of harm and abuse? And when you start asking that question, that's when you start to see patterns. And then the patterns become sort of the story of this book, which is how these pastors insulate themselves with layers of protection, how they evade accountability, how these churches amass crazy amounts of money, including Life Church, which has more revenue than the GDPs of some countries, hundreds of millions of dollars,
Yes.
which is insane. And that's when you start to see patterns. So yes, it's true that you can get hurt in a church of any size, certainly. But I think that it's much easier to be anonymous in a large church, because I've felt that. And I think that's where the issue is, Jake, is that if you do experience something painful or harmful, you don't just lose your church, you lose everything. You lose all those things we named earlier, your whole community, and your kids lose their community, and you don't feel like you have a voice necessarily to raise a concern to a pastor like a Craig Rochelle or a Joel Osteen. You don't have a relationship with that person. So anyway, so those are some of the problems that I think are unique to really large churches.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's helpful to I'm glad you mentioned that. I think that's important to know, to think about. And let's get into those patterns now, because that's where I want to go here. This is the real meat of the book and things. So I mean, you highlight a lot of alarming issues. I'm kind of using this term spiritual abuse for this episode, but very broadly, a lot of what you cover is sexual abuse. There's abuses of different kinds, but a lot of it is some kind of sexual abuse, whether underage or overage, whatever. It's not consensual, non-consensual stuff is happening, and made me very angry. As I mentioned at the top of the show, like seeing these things and seeing people get away with them, at least for a time. And so a lot of that comes back to this lack of accountability. That's the theme, and I want to know what you think, but that's the theme I kept seeing over and over again. It's just lack of accountability is where all these problems are allowed to breed and fester, and it just gets really bad. So talk to us about this. What makes megachurches so prone to kind of this lack of accountability? Can you share some examples in the research? What is the issue with why this stuff is allowed to be rampant, or the pastor that abuses somebody is then shuffled around somewhere else and then they're restored 2 years later or something? You know, we can get the book to get all the details, but if you give us some highlights here, help us understand this whole accountability issue.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of one of the really big questions as megachurches grow their influence and footprint, is what does accountability look like in these churches? Because the other thing is, most megachurches now are non-denominational, so they don't even have denominational accountability, which isn't really a real thing, but at least it's something. But they don't even really have that. Right. So we've all seen like megachurch scandals in the last few years. You had Bill Hybels, you had Mark Driscoll, you had Ravi Zacharias, you had all these guys, you can name them. And so, Hillsong, of course. And I mean, like, there's documentaries on this and there's a whole podcast series on this. So megachurch scandals are certainly nothing new. They go back, to the beginning. But I think that they mean something different now. And I think especially post Me Too and post Church Too, which came off of Me Too, which highlighted stories of sexual abuse and power in the church, I think that people started asking these big questions about how do these guys get away with this? And so the first real third of the book talks about this practice of what gets called pastoral restoration, which is the notion that a pastor can commit some sort of offense, some sort of infraction at his church. It's usually called like a moral failure. It often means an extramarital affair, but it can be much worse. But the church is not really told at all what happened. These pastors are taken out of their church. They're put onto the staff of another church. They're kind of laundered for a couple of years. There's no consistent number for how long they should be there. They go through some sort of opaque restoration practice that is not transparent. The victim, the survivor, is not brought into that process at all. They're not given any sort of voice. And then after a period of a year or 2 years, that guy is either kept on that staff, he's sent back to where he came from, or he goes to another church. There's a lot of issues with that from where I was coming from, which is, the big problem is there's no consistent understanding of what pastoral restoration means and what sort of infraction would be over the line to make a pastor, to disqualify a pastor from being restored, right? So if you steal a pack of gum from Target versus if you sexually abuse a child, like there's no answer in scripture for where that line is. But as I was asking pastors that, they also could not give me an answer. And so I found a study from Lifeway Research from the Southern Baptist Convention where they asked pastors, if a pastor has an affair, how long should he be out of the pulpit? And there was no consistent answer. Even pastors could not agree on this. So I wanted to kind of spotlight the voices of the people. And in my retelling, it's women specifically who were hurt by these men behind closed doors, often in the doors of the church, and had to watch as those pastors were put back into the pulpit and often got quite wealthy and got their power back. And so the book opens with the story of Cindy Clemisher, who was sexually abused in Oklahoma, where you are, by Robert Morris in the 80s, and her story of fighting for accountability decade after decade after decade. It took 42 years of her trying to get someone to take her seriously as he got powerful and got access to the White House and got extremely wealthy and became one of the most influential pastors in America. No one cared. No one would give her the time of day. And it wasn't until she went to a blogger a couple of years ago that her story finally broke through, which is why he's in jail right now on 5 counts of sexual abuse of a child. And he went through the practice of pastoral restoration in the 80s and was put back in the pulpit. And so you start to pop the hood on this, right? And you're like, well, how does this happen? And really what you see is that a lot of megachurch pastors say that they have 2 forms of accountability. They have what's called overseers and they have trustees. But the pattern that you see is that these guys, and it's often men, almost always men, are handpicked by the pastors themselves. And so they're choosing their friends, they're choosing guys in their circle, and that's, sketched out in the book in depth. But the question just becomes, can you count on your friend to hold you accountable? Can you do it if you mutually benefit from each other's net worth? That's another big question. There's a lot of money in this world.
Yes.
So that really becomes the question is that accountability? What would that even look like at churches this size? But there's just too many examples of people getting hurt by it.
Yeah. I believe it was a quote from Boz in your book about how, if a lawyer has sex with their client, like, there goes the license. Doctors will get in trouble. And then if a pastor does that, not a crime, not an issue in like most of states. And that was a really interesting, powerful framing for me.
Very powerful.
Like,
especially
we don't have these same kind of standards or legal protection. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, especially because that's Billy Graham's grandson saying that quote. So Boz Chivijan, who I interview in the book, was representing Cindy Clemisher as her attorney. And at the time, it was not thought that you could even bring criminal charges against Robert Morris through the statute of limitations. Eventually, they found out that you could. But at the time, her only restitution was civil restitution. So her lawyer is Boz Chivijan, who he's really the only or the most prominent attorney who is suing churches on behalf of clients who have suffered sexual abuse, and it's minors and it's adults. And he's a great character because, again, his grandfather's Billy Graham, the most famous pastor in world history, who preached to more people than any man ever. And Boz tried to help churches. He tried to give them the tools to prevent abuse in the church. He started an organization called Grace, and these abuses kept happening. So he started suing them. And the day before I flew to Florida to meet him, he had sued First Baptist Dallas on behalf of a father whose son was allegedly sexually abused on a church trip by another student. So he gave that great quote where we were talking about accountability. And he said, I'm a lawyer. If I have sex with my client, I'll lose my license. If I'm a doctor and I do it, I'll go to jail. Never mind lose my license. But if you're a pastor, nothing. You don't have to have a license to be a pastor. You don't have to go before a disciplinary board. Your only accountability is the accountability you build around you. And sometimes there's pastors who do it right, I'm sure, but the pastors who were cited in the book certainly did not, because it was their friends and their friends couldn't step in when they needed to.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yes, there's a lot. There's a lot. I am I don't like these big organizations just naturally. I'm not saying that about any particular organization, but like I grew up in a small church, very like very non-denominational in the sense of don't like the hierarchy, don't like all this stuff. So I get mad at these big systems. Of any system that gets so big and just tramples people underfoot. It's so heartbreaking to see. I don't like it, and we keep doing it and don't seem to learn our lessons, which is really not good. So, oh my goodness, one of the other aspects of mega churches that you talk about, though, we mentioned a little bit in our definition of mega church, is that they're a part of all our lives. So, we talked about and scratched the surface of how accountability is a major issue in why all this bad stuff happens. But we also have people that stick around or don't feel like they can speak up amidst this kind of harm and things like that. So, can you talk more about how this kind of total immersion makes it hard to leave even when things are really bad?
Yeah. So I think what doesn't get talked about enough is that it's really hard to leave a church. It can be really hard to leave a church. And that was one thing. That's one thing that you hear from people. I spoke to some people who were evangelicals in reporting for the book. We talked about abuse in the church, and I had one guy say to me, his quote was, "No one holds a gun to your head and forces you to stay at your church." Well, okay, that might be literally true, but it's hard to leave a church. It's grief to leave a church, right? Like I went through this. I've had family members go through this. It's especially if it's a mega church and it's your whole community. What if it's where your kids go to school? If it's your kids' friend group? Like I had a woman in the book who was abused by her pastor in Washington, and she had 4 daughters who were all in that church. It was all of their friends. They had gone there for 20 years. You can't just say to someone like that, well, just walk away. Like it's not your job. It's not the law. Just walk away. It's hard. It's hard to leave a church. And mega churches are designed very intentionally to draw you more deeply in and let you feel an emotional connection to that church through their music, through their lighting, through their branding. They have any number of ways that they design the experience for you to feel emotionally connected to the service. And so I don't think it's enough to just say to someone, well, there's 10,000 people who go to this church. You had a bad experience. You can just find another church. I think it's harder. It's harder than that. It's hard to leave a church, especially if you're involved in it. And so the onus gets put on the victim. The onus gets put on the member of the congregation, but it needs to be put on the leadership. It needs to be put on the system and the structure. And I had someone say to me in the book, she had a really harmful experience at her megachurch college, which is a whole other thing that megachurches are starting colleges, is this wild world. And she said that she could not raise that concern to church leadership because it was so easy for them to just write you off as one person. And personally, by the way, you feel like you must have done something wrong because look at how this church is growing and look how God's blessing it and look at the impact that it's having. This must have been something you did wrong, right? It couldn't have been the church because look how the church is having so much influence. She said the only way to get their attention is to raise the voice of the collective, to come to them as a group. And so that's kind of what I hope that the book does, is that it spotlights lots of these voices to illustrate these patterns and practices and try to show that the onus is actually on the church to solve these problems. It's not on people like Cindy Clemisher who have to fight decade after decade for accountability. It should be on leadership, these men in power, to actually get it right.
Yes, yes, that's very important to highlight for sure. And I think your book does a good job of that. There's all sorts of stories. A few I knew about, some names I've never heard of before. Um, all sorts of stories, and I think it does. It raises an alarm for me as somebody that truly deeply cares about the church. It raises an alarm, and I want to do something about it. I want to do something different, but it's tough. It's I don't even go to a mega church, and it's tough to leave my church over theological differences. Like that grief is so real, um, and it's tough to. In a couple weeks, we're going to be having Amy Fritz on the show. I know you were on her show, Entangled Faith, and we're going to talk about the dynamics, the nuances of speaking up and not speaking up. We're going to talk about that more in depth. And it's tough. It's really tough, but absolutely 100%. The leadership should have been doing better. There should have been better systems, and there should have been, my opinion, people actually doing what Jesus would want instead of all this not great, not Jesus kinds of stuff. But that's just me. So um, I am curious as we kind of start to wrap up here. If you think we should write off the whole megachurch enterprise, because all right, loaded question. I mean, I am somebody who what I study a lot in theology and spaces is things of efficiency, and the argument I get a lot is the pooling of resources. We can do so much more good when it's so big. And maybe here, Scott, you could talk more about the financial side and how much of that actually goes to missions and things like that. But I mean, help us here, like the pros and cons. Like this is an opinion, but obviously you've done a lot of research and talked to a lot of different people here. Um, should we be doing this megachurch thing? Does that seem like a healthy, good thing for the world or not?
Mm.
I don't know.
Well, I'll take a step back here and I'll just tell you what people told me in the reporting and
Yes.
what Boz actually told me, which is that I don't see any way you could reform this world that would actually be sustainable and effective. And what a researcher told me, which is that megachurches attract narcissists, because you have to believe that you're called by God to stand on a stage in front of 60,000 people. You have to believe you're set apart and special. And that's not really a normal thing to think about yourself. And so, first of all, I mean, the pros and cons of megachurches, I don't know. Like, I try not to paint with too broad of a brush and say they're all bad, they're all good, because everyone's faith story is different. Everyone's, people who've experienced pain, like all of those stories are different. And I had people who experienced excruciating pain who are still going to church. And I would listen to their story and go, how can you go back in that building? And then I had people who experienced something and they walked away forever and they're never going back. And it's all valid. It's all valid because it's their personal experience. So I think for me, the question is, it's almost a foregone conclusion to me that these churches are just going to continue to grow their power, their influence, and their footprint. So we have to think of them as a large system, like universities or businesses or the military, right? They're just human design systems. So then it becomes questions of power and control and accountability. So the same way that you would set up financial accountability for a corporation, you need to set up financial accountability for a church. It's no different. And, talking about what these churches do with their money, I spoke with a tax expert in the book who has researched this. And he said that if you look at church budgets, which churches are not required to make transparent, if we could start a church today, Jake, and we wouldn't have to tell the IRS, we'd have to file no paperwork. We can hide all that money and do whatever we want with it. He said that, but Life Church actually is one of the ones that they do publish their financials, I will say. And there is a movement for churches to be more transparent. And a lot of them do. Not enough, but some of them do. But anyway, he told me that the average church spends less than 5% of their budget on missions and charity. And so his quote to me was, if you take the definition of a church to be any church that spends at least 51%, the majority of its money, on charitable services, he said you wouldn't have a single church in America. You wouldn't have one. Wow. Because I think, you look at the numbers, and these churches spend 2%, 3% on actual charity and missions. And so I don't know. I mean, a lot of the churches in the book, I tried not to be too cynical about it, but you just come away thinking that they're tax-free real estate businesses. I mean, that's the other thing, is that the megachurch model has completely flipped in the last 25 years, where at the turn of the century and in the 80s and 90s, the world that I grew up in, megachurches were big buildings. They were big auditoriums and sanctuaries. That's not what you see anymore. Now it's the multi-campus model, where you have like a Life Church that has like 40 something campuses, or
I know, right?
CCV in Phoenix has 18, Church of the Highlands in Alabama has 26. So the goal is growth. The goal is real estate, it's footprint. And that's just a completely different, that opens you up to a whole completely different set of questions. So to me, like, the thing that matters the most right now is accountability, and meaning external accountability, because internal accountability is a contradiction. It's an oxymoron.
Yeah. I remember I had a friend that went to a big mega church in the Portland area when I grew up there. And it was like we were in middle school or whatever. He worked on the tech stuff. And I remember him saying one day, he's like, yeah, we just got this new $60,000 light for the auditorium. I'm like, what? Like, we're spending that on lighting? What's going on here? So yeah, I got a lot of questions about how some of the money is spent at any church, especially those mega churches. I think that's important to bring up. That's very, very important.
Well, there was one of the pastors I look at in the book is Mark Driscoll, who, is one of the most influential megachurch pastors in America at Mars Hill in Seattle. And there's a podcast series, great podcast series, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill by Christianity Today, that unpacks his history of abuse and how the church really tried to hold him accountable. And they say in that podcast, at one point, the creative team at Mars Hill was 60 people on staff. Whoa. Just making videos and doing creative work there. So yeah, it's wild, like the amount of money in these churches.
Man, Scott, we could go in all sorts of different directions. Whenever I have an author on the show, I'm prone to say, read their book, because that is where the rest of the conversation is. This is just an appetizer, if you will, to the book. So Scott, tell us where to find the book. Tell us all the links, whatever you want people to do to follow you, to keep up with your work, what you're up to these days. Tell us a little bit about all that.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. So you can find the book online on Amazon or on bookshop.org. If you don't want to buy on Amazon, I have links on my own website. It's in stores. Yeah, Jake's holding it up. You can find it pretty much anywhere. But my website is just scottlatta.com. I'm still reporting on this. I have a Substack called God's the Smoke Machine, where I'm reporting on this. I wrote a piece about, there's a megachurch pastor, Mekon Carter, who gets reported on the book. There was an update on his story last week. So I'm still keeping the conversation going. You can find me on there. I'm on Blue Sky and Twitter and places like that. So you can get all of that at my website. But thanks for having me, man. I appreciate the opportunity to come on, and thanks for reading the book.
Absolutely. I appreciated it. And I didn't mention this, but I got to meet you in real life. You signed the book when you came to Oklahoma at my favorite bookstore. It was perfect. And it was so interesting about that. I'm curious to hear what your other crowds were like. That was a very older crowd, old white people crowd in conservative Oklahoma. And I was scared for you, Scott. But it was a great conversation. They asked good questions and they were thoughtful and seemed to agree with you. It honestly gave me a little bit of hope in the world. It really, truly did.
No, I got to tell you, man, I did 2 events in Oklahoma. They were my favorite events I did. The crowds were into it. Yeah. They were huge. I loved it. It was my first time in Oklahoma. So I went to Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and both events were packed. And like you said, the people were so generous. And I mean, people across all my events were very generous. And I had pastors come to events and thank me for the book. So I was nervous going into it. I was nervous going to certain places that are pretty critical to word. But no, everyone was great. And that night was really cool. And had some great moderators and hosts. So it was really fun to get out on the road. And it was great to meet you in person in your neck of the woods.
Absolutely. I love to get signed books. It's just, I just think it's cool to have a signed book on my bookshelf. So that was neat. Well, we got one more question for you. The last question all the guests get, where we get really insanely practical. And so here's the question. I'm going to read it to you as every guest gets it. So, As we close, leave the audience with just one practical action they can do this week to live out their faith fully for Jesus.
Great question. Great question. And my idea would be ask your church what they're doing. What is their practice of external accountability for their pastor? Who are the trustees? Who are the overseers? What is their relationship to the pastor? If the church is not transparent about finances, ask them why. It's okay to ask these questions. It's okay to do that. I think it's actually incumbent on us to do that who go to church, because if you don't do it, no one else will. And maybe there's nothing shady going on. That's great. I hope there's not. But the point is that the church should not try to hide anything from you. And if they are, then I think you should start asking hard questions about why they're doing it and if that's the right church for you. But that's one, is ask hard questions of your church, and that's okay. The other one, though, is if you have experienced something painful or harmful or traumatic in your church, know that that's okay, and know that it's not your fault, and know that your experience is valid and you're not alone. And whatever you feel about your faith or whatever you feel about God or your church or yourself, is not your fault. And there's a lot of people in the book and a lot of people I met and that all of us know who have experiences like that. And it's okay to be hurt by your church. It's not okay that the church hurt you, but it's okay that you had that experience, and to start working through it. It doesn't mean anything about yourself or your relationship to God or anything like that. So those would be my two.
Oh, those are great ones. I love it. Thank you so much for ending on those really important thoughts. Those are exactly practical things that we should put into practice, and some mindset shifts there. Well, once again, thank you so much, Scott, for a great episode, for a great book, all of that stuff. Appreciate you being a voice in this space, and for coming on the show and agreeing to all of that. I always recommend people to share this episode with a certain kind of person so we can get the word out about these great conversations. Today you could share this episode with all kinds of people. Anybody who goes to church, there you go. That's a great one. Anybody who maybe has experienced some of these questions or troubles, is concerned about the rise of spiritual abuse in the church. That's a topic we've talked about in different facets quite a bit on Christianity Without Compromise of the past. And let me tell you, in 2026, we're still having that conversation with several new episodes. So stay tuned and spread the word about these conversations, because I have these cool interviews so we can all learn and be transformed and think differently. So once again, Scott, appreciate you so much, man.
Yeah, you too, man. Thanks for having me.
This episode of Christianity Without Compromise was hosted by me, Jake Doberenz, and produced by Theophany Media, my podcast production company. If this conversation served you, please rate and review the show and share it with a friend and help others find it. You can also subscribe at jakedoberenz.substack.com to get email updates with new episodes every Tuesday and my often humorous theological reflections on Fridays. And as always, don't just listen, live it. Live out that Christianity without compromise. Thanks for listening.